1898 Portrait Unearthed, and historians tremble when they enlarge the sisters' hands. The photograph emerged from a cardboard box in the attic of a Savannah estate sale in March 2024. Mrs. Dorothy Williams, the elderly homeowner who had recently passed, had been a collector of historical documents and family memorabilia spanning generations. Her great-nephew, sorting through decades of accumulated belongings, nearly discarded the box before noticing the delicate sepia-toned image tucked between layers of yellowed rain newspaper. He brought it to the Savannah Historical Society, where it was catalogued as part of a donation of African American historical materials. The Society's director immediately recognized its potential significance and contacted Dr. Thomas Bennett at the Southern Museum of African American History in Atlanta. Thomas arrived in Savannah on a humid April morning. The photograph awaited him in the climate-controlled archive room, protected now in an acid-free sleeve. He lifted it carefully, his practiced eyes taking in every detail. 3 young women sat in a formal studio arrangement, their postures rigid with the solemnity typical of 19th-century photography. They wore their finest dresses, dark fabrics with high collars and long sleeves, modest and dignified. Their faces were serious, unsiling, as was customary for portraits of that era. The backdrop showed painted columns and draped curtains and standard props for photography studios in the 1890s. A small placard at the bottom of the photograph read, "Savannah, Georgia, 1898. Nothing else. No names, no photographer's mark, no indication of who these women were. Thomas studied their faces first. The sister on the left appeared to be the youngest, perhaps 18 or 19. The middle sister looked slightly older, maybe in her early 20s. The eldest, seated on the right, might have been 25. They shared similar features: high cheekbones, deep-set eyes, full lips, clearly siblings, possibly even born close together in age. Their clothing suggested modest means but careful preparation. The dresses, while simple, were clean and well-maintained. Small brooches adorned each woman's collar. Their hair was styled conservatively, pulled back from their faces in the fashion of the time. Then Thomas noticed their hands. All 3 women had positioned their hands in their laps, palms turned slightly upward, an unusual pose for the era, when women typically rested their hands palm down or folded them together. Thomas leaned closer, then reached for his magnifying glass. His breath caught in his throat. Even without magnification, the scars were visible, but under the glass, they became impossible to ignore. Deep lines crossed each palm, running in irregular patterns across fingers and knuckles. The skin texture was uneven, suggesting old burns or wounds that had healed poorly. On the youngest sister's right hand, the pinky finger bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken and never properly set. Thomas set down the magnifying glass and picked up his phone. His hands trembled slightly as he photographed the image, zooming in on each woman's hands in turn. He had examined thousands of historical photographs in his 15-year career. He had seen evidence of hardship, poverty, and suffering preserved in countless images, but never had he seen anything quite like this. These women had deliberately displayed their scars. They had chosen to position their hands in a way that made the damage visible, impossible to miss. This was intentional. This meant something. Thomas returned to Atlanta that evening, the photograph carefully packed in his briefcase. He barely slept, his mind racing through possibilities. By dawn, he was in his office at the museum, the image already uploaded to his computer and displayed across 2 monitors. He began the painstaking work of enhancement, adjusting contrast and sharpness to reveal every detail the original photograph held. Under digital magnification, the scars became even more pronounced. The youngest sister's hands showed what appeared to be rope burns around both wrists, old injuries that had left permanent darkening of the skin. The middle sister had a pattern of small circular scars across her palms, burns perhaps from hot metal or coals. The eldest sister's hands were the most severely damaged. Multiple fingers showed signs of breaks, and a long, deep scar ran from her left thumb across her palm to her wrist. Thomas pulled up his database of plantation records, focusing on rice plantations in coastal Georgia. Rice cultivation in the antebellum South had been among the most brutal forms of slave labor, surpassing even cotton production in its mortality rates. The work required constant immersion in flooded fields, exposure to disease-carrying mosquitoes, mews and back-breaking labor under the scorching sun. Injuries were common. Cuts from sharp rice stalks, infections from contaminated water, breaks and sprains from heavy lifting. He cross-referenced the 1898 date with emancipation records. If these women had been enslaved, they would have been freed in 1865 with the end of the Civil War. That meant they could have been born into slavery, worked in the fields as children and young women, and survived to see freedom. By 1898, they would have been in their late 20s to early 30s, roughly matching the apparent ages in the photograph. Thomas contacted the Savannah Historical Society and requested any documentation that had accompanied the photograph. 2 days later, he received a scanned package of materials, a brittle envelope containing 3 folded letters, a small leather-bound journal, and a handwritten note on the back of the photograph itself. The note, written in careful script, read, "Clara, Ruth, and Josephine, daughters of Rebecca, rice workers, Oak Plantation, 1852-1865. Free women, Savannah, Georgia, 1898. This portrait commissioned to remember what must never be forgotten." Thomas felt electricity run through him. Names, a plantation, a purpose. The photograph wasn't just a portrait. It was a memorial, a testimony, a deliberate act of historical documentation. He immediately began researching Oakhurst Plantation. Census records from 1860 listed it as one of the largest rice operations in Liberty County, Georgia, with over 300 enslaved people working its fields. The plantation had been owned by the Ashford family, wealthy planters who had built their fortune on rice exports to Europe and the Caribbean. Among the plantation records preserved at the Georgia Historical Society, Thomas found slave inventories, dehumanizing lists of human beings categorized by age, gender, and assigned value. He scrolled through the 1860 inventory, his stomach tightening with each entry, until he found them. Rebecca, female, age 28, field hand, rice cultivation value, $800. Below her name, 3 more entries. Clara, female, age 8, child of Rebecca, field hand value, $400. Ruth, female, age 6, child of Rebecca, field hand, value $350. Josephine, female, age 4, child of Rebecca, field hand, value $300. Children. They had been children working in the rice fields, 8 years old, 6 years old, 4 years old. Thomas closed his eyes, trying to control the wave of grief and rage that swept through him. The 3 letters that had accompanied the photograph were written in the same careful handwriting as the note on the back. Thomas arranged to examine the originals at the Savannah Historical Society's archive. He traveled back to Savannah, this time bringing Patricia, his colleague, and the museum specialist in 19th-century African-American correspondence. They sat together in the archive's reading room, white cotton gloves protecting their hands. As they carefully unfolded the first letter, it was dated May 15, 1898, addressed to whom it may concern, and signed by Clara. Patricia read aloud, "My name is Clara, and I'm writing this to explain the photograph we have commissioned. My sisters Ruth and Josephine and I are free women now, but we were not born free. We were born into bondage on Oak Plantation in Liberty County, and we worked in the rice fields, from the time we could walk until Union soldiers came and told us we were free. I was 13 years old when freedom came. Ruth was 11. Josephine was 9. The letter continued, "Our mother, Rebecca, died in the fields when I was 10 years old. She collapsed during harvest season, and the overseer would not let anyone help her until the day's work was finished. By then, it was too late. They buried her in the plantation cemetery with no marker, no name, nothing to show she had ever lived. I remember her hands most of all. They looked like ours do now, scarred and broken from the work, from the punishments, from the rice." Thomas and Patricia exchanged glances. The quiet horror of the words settled over them like a physical weight. Clara's letter went on to describe the work in detail. Children as young as 4 were assigned tasks in the rice fields, pulling weeds, scaring birds away from seedlings, carrying water to the adult workers. As they grew older, the work intensified. By age 8, they were expected to work alongside adults, bending in the flooded fields for 12 to 14 hours a day during planting and harvest seasons. The water was never clean, Clara wrote. Cuts and scratches would fester and infect within days. I saw girls lose fingers to infection, saw boys develop fevers that never broke. The overseer carried a whip and used it freely. My first scar came when I was 6 years old. I had moved too slowly, and he struck my hand with a cane. The bone broke, but was never set properly. That is why my smallest finger bends the way it does. The second letter, written by Ruth, described the specific injuries each sister had sustained. Ruth's circular scars came from a punishment when she was 9 years old. She had tried to save a small portion of her food ration to give to a younger child who was starving. When discovered, the overseer had heated metal discs and pressed them against her palms as punishment and warning to others. I screamed until I had no voice left, Ruth wrote, but I would do it again. The child lived. Her name was Sarah, and she survived to see freedom. That is worth any scar. Josephine's letter, the third and longest, explained why they had chosen to have the photograph taken with their hands positioned as they were. We know that some people want to forget what slavery was truly like. They speak of kind masters and happy workers, of plantations as grand estates where everyone had their place. These are lies. We have our hands as proof. Every scar tells a truth that words can be twisted to deny. So, we had this photograph made, and we positioned our hands so the scars would show clearly. Let anyone who sees this image know what slavery cost us. Let them see the price we paid for the freedom we now claim. Thomas obtained permission to access the complete Oakhurst plantation records housed in multiple archives across Georgia. The Ashford family papers were split between the University of Georgia's Enns Special Collections and the Georgia Historical Society. He spent 2 weeks traveling between Athens and Savannah, photographing documents and taking meticulous notes. The plantation ledgers were coldly detailed, recording every aspect of the operation with business-like precision. Production numbers, profit margins, expenses for equipment and supplies, and interspersed throughout, casual notations about human suffering that made Thomas's hands shake as he read them. An entry from August 1858. Rebecca's daughter, Clara, disobedient during harvest, corrected with 10 lashes. Production resumed. Clara would have been 6 years old. Another from September 1861. 3 field hands lost to fever this week. Rebecca remains productive despite illness. Her children adequate workers for their ages. Their mother had been sick, possibly dying, and the only concern documented was whether she could still work. The overseer's diary, preserved in remarkable detail, was even worse. Marcus Petton had served as Ost's overseer from 1855 until the plantation's collapse in 1865. His daily entries mixed mundane observations about weather and crops with brutal accounts of punishments, accidents, and deaths. June 14, 1862. Ruth attempted to steal food from the kitchen house, administered correction to ensure compliance. These children must learn discipline early, or they become unmanageable. Thomas found medical records kept by the plantation's doctor, who visited quarterly to assess the health of the enslaved workforce, not out of compassion, but to protect the financial investment each person represented. An entry from 1863 described treating Josephine for a severe infection in her right hand, the result of a cut from a rice sickle that had gone untreated for a week. The doctor noted that amputation might become necessary if the infection spread further. Somehow, Josephine had survived with her hand intact, though Thomas could see in the photograph the permanent damage that infection had left. He discovered lists of punishments categorized by offense. Slowness in work, 5 lashes. Speaking without permission, 10 lashes. Attempting to learn reading, 20 lashes. Attempting escape, 50 lashes, or sale. Children received the same punishments as adults, though sometimes the number of lashes was reduced for those under 10 years old. And there the records also revealed the plantation's productivity expectations. Each adult worker was expected to maintain 1 acre of rice fields, a task that required constant labor from sunrise to well past sunset during planting and harvest seasons. Children were expected to contribute proportionally to their age and size. Failure to meet quotas resulted in reduced food rations, physical punishment, or both. Thomas found evidence of the sisters' mother, Rebecca, throughout the records. She appeared frequently in productivity reports as one of the plantation's most efficient workers, a designation that likely meant she worked herself beyond exhaustion to protect her daughters from punishment. An entry from 1860 noted that Rebecca had requested permission for her daughters to work alongside her rather than in separate field sections. The request was denied. The overseer's note explained, "Keeping families together reduces overall productivity. Children work harder when separated from parents." The letters had mentioned that the sisters had descendants, people who might still carry their story. Thomas began the painstaking process of tracing their bloodlines forward through 126 years of history. He started with Savannah city directories, census records, and church registries from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Clara had married in 1901 to a man named William, a carpenter who had also been born into slavery. They had 4 children, all born in Savannah between 1902 and 1910. Thomas traced the family through subsequent censuses, following them as they moved from Savannah to Atlanta during the Great Migration of the 1920s. Clara had died in 1936 at age 74. Ruth had never married, but she had adopted 2 children, orphaned by the 1918 influenza epidemic. She had worked as a seamstress and later as a teacher at a school for African American children. She died in 1941, also in Atlanta, at age 79. Josephine had married twice. Her first husband died in a workplace accident in 1905. She remarried in 1988 and had 3 children. She had worked as a midwife, delivering hundreds of babies in Savannah's African American community over a 40-year career. She died in 1948 at age 86, the last surviving sister. Through genealogical databases and marriage records, Thomas traced the sisters' descendants forward. He found dozens of them scattered across the United States. Atlanta, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, Houston. Many had achieved remarkable success. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, business owners, artists, all of them living lives of freedom and opportunity that their ancestors had been denied. Thomas began making contact. His first call went to Atlanta to a woman named Dr. Grace Williams, a retired physician who was Clara's great-great-granddaughter. When Thomas explained who he was and what he had found, Grace was silent for a long moment. "I've heard stories," she finally said. "My grandmother used to talk about her grandmother Clara. She said Clara had scars on her hands and would sometimes show them to the children, telling them to remember what freedom had cost. But we never knew there was a photograph." "There is," Thomas confirmed. "And there are letters. Your ancestor wanted this story preserved. She wanted people to know." Grace agreed to meet him the following week. When she arrived at the museum, Thomas had the photograph displayed on a large monitor, the image enhanced to show every detail. Grace stood before it for several minutes without speaking, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "That's her," she whispered. "That's Clara. I can see my grandmother in her face. I can see myself." She looked at the scarred hands now impossibly clear on the screen. They survived all of that. They survived and built families and lives. We exist because they refuse to be broken. Thomas showed her the letters. Grace read them slowly, carefully, occasionally stopping to wipe her eyes. When she finished, she looked up at him. "What are you going to do with this?" "Tell their story," Thomas said. "If you'll give me permission, I want to create an exhibition, publish the research, make sure people understand what these women endured and what they achieved." Grace nodded. "They wanted to be remembered. They created this photograph as testimony. Yes, you have my permission. Tell the world what they survived." As Thomas continued his research, he discovered that the sisters hadn't simply survived their enslavement. They had spent their lives fighting to ensure others understood what slavery had truly been. In the decades following the photograph, all 3 had become active in their communities. speaking publicly about their experiences during a time when many former slaves chose to remain silent about their suffering. He found newspaper articles from the early 1900s documenting their activism. A piece from the Savannah Tribune in 1903 described a speech Clara had given at the First African Baptist Church. Miss Clara spoke with quiet dignity about her years in bondage. The article reported, when she showed her hands to the congregation, the scars still visible after nearly 40 years of freedom, and spoke of the brutal conditions she and her sisters endured as children in the rice fields. Her testimony moved many to tears, and strengthened the resolve of all present to ensure such horrors never return. Ruth had worked with the National Association of Colored Women, an organization founded in 1896 to advocate for African American women's rights and social reform. In archived correspondence between Ruth and the organization's leadership, Thomas found letters where Ruth described using the photograph as an educational tool. "I carry the portrait with me when I speak," she wrote in 1905. "When people question whether slavery was truly as terrible as we claim, when they suggest that perhaps some masters were kind and some slaves were content, I show them our hands. I let the scars speak when words fail to convince." Josephine had focused her activism on education and healthcare in African American communities. As a midwife, she had delivered hundreds of babies and cared for countless mothers, many of them daughters and granddaughters of formerly enslaved people. In a diary entry from 1915, preserved by her descendants, she wrote, "Every healthy child I bring into this world is a victory over the system that tried to destroy us. Every mother who survives childbirth is proof that we are stronger than they believed. I think of my own mother who died because no one would help her when she collapsed in the field. I became a midwife to honor her memory and to ensure no other mother dies alone and uncared for if I can prevent it." Thomas discovered that the sisters had been part of a broader movement of formerly enslaved people who fought against the revisionist history, already taking root in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The lost cause narrative, which romanticized the antebellum South and minimized the brutality of slavery, was gaining traction in popular culture and academic circles. Against this whitewashing of history, survivors like the sisters insisted on telling the truth. He found records of their participation in oral history projects, including interviews conducted by researchers in the 1920s and 1930s as part of early efforts to document the experiences of formerly enslaved people. In a 1928 interview, Clara, then 76 years old, was asked if she held any anger toward those who had enslaved her. Her response was measured but firm. "I hold anger toward the system that made it possible. I hold anger toward those who now deny what that system was. My hands bear witness. My sister's hands bear witness. We cannot and will not allow the truth to be forgotten, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people." Thomas became curious about who had taken the photograph and why the sisters had chosen that particular photographer. Research into Savannah's photography studios in 1898 led him to discover that the image had been taken by a man named Isaiah Crawford, one of the few African-American photographers operating in Georgia at that time. Crawford's story was remarkable in its own right. Born into slavery in 1845, he had learned photography as an apprentice after the Civil War and had opened his own studio in Savannah in 1888. His business served primarily African-American clients, offering them dignified portraiture at a time when many white-owned studios refused to photograph black customers or subjected them to demeaning treatment. Thomas located Crawford's business records and correspondence at the Savannah Historical Society. Among them was a ledger entry for the sisters' photograph dated April 1898. Next to the entry, Crawford had written, "Portrait of 3 sisters, survivors, no charge. This is sacred work." In a letter Crawford had written to a fellow photographer in 1899, he explained his philosophy. "I believe photography has the power to preserve truth in ways that words cannot. When I photograph our people, I am creating evidence of our dignity, our humanity, our survival. The sisters who came to my studio last year wished to document their scars. Some might have refused such a request, thinking it improper or disturbing, but I understood immediately what they were doing. They were creating testimony. They were ensuring that future generations would have undeniable proof of what slavery truly cost. I was honored to be part of that act of witness. Crawford had been particular about how the photograph was taken. According to his technical notes, he had used specific lighting to ensure the scars on the sisters' hands would be clearly visible. He had positioned them carefully, suggesting the hand placement that would make the damage most apparent while maintaining the formal dignity of a portrait. He had taken multiple exposures to ensure at least one would capture every detail with perfect clarity. Thomas found more of Crawford's work in various archives, hundreds of portraits of African American families, individuals, and community leaders from the 1890s through the 1920s. Many showed deliberate choices to document aspects of black life that white photographers ignored or misrepresented. Crawford photographed churches, schools, businesses, and social organizations. He photographed workers, professionals, children, and elders. He created a visual record of a community's resilience and achievement in the face of ongoing oppression. But the sisters' portrait held a special place in his archive. In a note attached to his personal copy of the image, Crawford wrote, "This is perhaps the most important photograph I will ever take. These women trusted me to help them tell a truth that must never be forgotten. I pray this image survives long after we all gone, and that it continues to testify to what they endured and overcame." As Thomas prepared his research for publication and exhibition, he recognized the need to contextualize the sisters' story within the broader historical landscape of post-emancipation America. The photograph had been taken in 1898, a year that marked a particularly dark period in the history of race relations in the South. The Reconstruction era, which had offered brief hope for genuine equality and justice, had been systematically dismantled. By 1898, Jim Crow laws had solidified across the South, creating a rigid system of racial segregation and disenfranchisement. The Supreme Court's 1896 Pye v. Ferguson decision had legitimized separate but equal doctrine, giving legal sanction to discrimination. Lynching was at its peak, with hundreds of African Americans murdered by white mobs each year, often with the complicity of local authorities. In this context, the sisters' decision to commission a photograph that documented their suffering under slavery was not just personal testimony, it was political resistance. At a time when white supremacist narratives were being enshrined in law and culture, when the lost cause mythology was rewriting the history of the Civil War and slavery, three women chose to create undeniable visual evidence of the truth. Thomas found parallels between the sisters' photograph and other forms of documentation created by African Americans during this period. Frederick Douglass, who died in 1895, had been one of the most photographed Americans of the 19th century, deliberately using photography to counter racist caricatures and assert black humanity and dignity. Ida B. Wells had used photography in her anti-lynching campaigns, documenting both the victims of racial violence and the thriving black communities that contradicted racist stereotypes. The sisters were part of this tradition of using visual evidence as a tool of resistance and day truth-telling, but their approach was unique in its willingness to show not just achievement and dignity, but also suffering and trauma. They refused to allow their scars to be hidden or forgotten. Thomas also researched the rice plantation system specifically, understanding that this context was crucial to interpreting the sisters' injuries. Rice cultivation in the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country had been among the deadliest forms of agricultural labor in the Americas. The work required enslaved people to stand in flooded fields for hours at a time, often in water up to their knees or waist. Disease was rampant. Malaria, dysentery, and other illnesses spread quickly in the standing water and humid conditions. The mortality rate on rice plantations exceeded that of sugar plantations, which were notorious for their brutality. Children were particularly vulnerable. Many died before reaching adolescence. Those who survived, like the sisters, bore permanent physical evidence of the trauma they had endured. By 1898, most rice plantations in Georgia had ceased operation, unable to compete with rice production in other parts of the world, and unable to maintain profitability without enslaved labor. Our plantation had been abandoned in 1866, its fields reverting to wetlands. The Ashford family had moved away, their wealth diminished, but not destroyed. They left behind no memorials to the hundreds of people who had died building their fortune. But Clara, Ruth, and Josephine had created their own memorial. The photograph was their monument, more lasting than any marble statue, more truthful than any historical marker. Thomas spent 4 months developing the exhibition, working closely with the museum's design team and several descendants of the sisters. The exhibition would be titled Testimony and Scars, the story of Clara, Ruth, and Josephine, and would occupy the museum's main gallery space. The centerpiece would be the photograph itself, enlarged to nearly life-size and displayed with careful lighting that replicated Isaiah Crawford's original technique. Visitors would be able to see every detail, not just the scars, but the sisters' faces, their clothing, their posture. The image would be presented not as an object of pity, but as an act of defiance and documentation. Surrounding the photograph would be the context, plantation records showing the sisters as children, the overseer's brutal diary entries, the letters explaining why they chose to document their scars, Crawford's correspondence about the importance of the photograph. Interactive displays would allow visitors to explore rice plantation labor, the physics of the work, the medical consequences of the injuries enslaved people sustained. But Thomas and his team were careful to balance the documentation of trauma with the celebration of survival and resistance. The exhibition would also showcase what the sisters accomplished after emancipation: Clara's community organizing, Ruth's work in education, Josephine's career as a midwife. It would trace their descendants forward, showing family trees that extended to the present day, demonstrating that the sisters' survival had made possible the lives of hundreds of people who came after them. Dr. Grace Williams, Clara's great-great-granddaughter, helped curate a section on the sisters' legacy. She gathered photographs, documents, and stories from dozens of descendants. Together, they created a wall of family photographs spanning from 1898 to 2024, a visual timeline showing how one family had grown and flourished despite the trauma at its roots. Thomas also worked with scholars to create educational materials for schools. The exhibition would include a curriculum guide for teachers, helping them use the sisters' story to teach about slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and the ongoing struggle for racial justice. The materials were designed to be age-appropriate for different grade levels while never shying away from the truth of what the sisters had endured. 2 weeks before the exhibition's opening, Thomas held a private preview for the descendants. More than 60 people attended, representing 4 generations of Clara, Ruth, and Josephine's families. They walked through the gallery in silence at first, taking in the magnitude of what had been assembled. When they reached the enlarged photograph, the room fell completely quiet. Grace stood at the front, her hand reaching out as if to touch her ancestors' scarred hands. Behind her, a young girl, Grace's great-granddaughter, Clara's great-great-great-granddaughter, asked in a small voice, "Did that really happen to them?" Grace knelt down to the child's level. "Yes, it did. And they survived it. And they made sure we would know about it. That's why we're here. That's why this matters." The exhibition opened in October 2024, exactly 126 years after the photograph had been taken. Media coverage was extensive. Local, national, and international news organizations sent reporters. The story resonated deeply. 3 women who had survived slavery's brutality, who had chosen to document their scars, who had created testimony that survived more than a century. On opening day, the line to enter the museum stretched around the block. Thomas watched as hundreds of people filed through the gallery, many stopping for long periods before the photograph, reading the letters, absorbing the weight of the story. He saw people weeping, holding each other, taking photographs of the displays to share with others who couldn't attend. A group of high school students from a nearby school came on a field trip. Their teacher had them stand before the photograph and ask them what they noticed. One student pointed to Ruth's circular scars. "Those are burn marks," she said quietly. "Someone did that to her on purpose. She was just a kid." The recognition of that fact, that these were children who had been tortured, visibly affected the entire group. The exhibition sparked conversations far beyond the museum walls. Historians began re-examining other photographs from the post-emancipation period, looking for similar examples of deliberate documentation of slavery's physical and psychological toll. Several other photographs were identified where formerly enslaved people had chosen to display scars, missing limbs, or other evidence of the violence they had survived. Academic conferences were organized around the photograph and what it revealed about resistance, testimony, and historical memory. Papers were written analyzing the sisters' activism, Crawford's role as photographer, documentarian, and the ways visual evidence can challenge historical narratives that seek to minimize or deny past atrocities. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the descendants themselves. The exhibition became a gathering point for the extended family. Cousins who had never met discovered each other. Family reunions were organized. Genealogical research expanded, tracing even more branches of the family tree. Grace Williams worked with other descendants to establish a foundation in the sisters' names, focused on education about slavery's legacy and support for survivors of trauma and violence. "Our ancestors turned their pain into testimony," she explained at the foundation's launch. "We're turning their testimony into action." 6 months after the exhibition opened, Thomas received a letter from a woman in South Carolina. She had seen news coverage of the exhibition and recognized something in the photograph. Her own family history included stories of ancestors who had worked on rice plantations. She had photographs too, including one from 1902 that showed her great-great-grandmother's hands, similarly scarred. "I never understood what the scars meant," she wrote. "My family never talked about it, but now I know. Now I understand what she survived. Thank you for helping me see my ancestor truly for the first time." Thomas stood in the gallery one evening after closing, alone with the photograph. He thought about the journey it had taken from Isaiah Crawford's Savannah studio in 1898, through more than a century of storage in attics and boxes, to this moment of recognition and honor. He thought about Clara, Ruth, and Josephine, making the deliberate choice to document their raw trauma so that future generations would know the truth. The photograph had succeeded in its purpose. It had testified. It had survived. And it continued to speak 126 years after it was created, with a clarity and power that words alone could never achieve. The sisters' hands, scarred and broken by slavery, had become a bridge across time, connecting past suffering to present understanding, individual trauma to collective memory, and 3 women's courage to countless people's awakening. Their scars had become testimony. Their testimony had become history.